Indeed, there is no difference between perceiving subject and perceiving object, between having the perception and being the perception. Contrary to Husserlian phenomenological analyses, consciousness is not consciousness of something. Consciousness is something.
Ah, okay.
Okay.
I like that.
So let's review for a minute. When we looked at the Husserlian essay, Husserl took up the notion of intentionality from Franz Brentano. Intentionality is that characteristic of consciousness that it is always directed at something. Consciousness is of something. It could be a physical object. It could be a dream. It could be a feeling. Could be a sound. Could be many different things that appear in consciousness. But when we say that I am conscious, we are always conscious of something. Okay? That's Husserl. So what Ruyer is saying here is that consciousness is something. There is no distinction between a subject and an object.
Right.
Okay?
Okay.
So then he mentions Abbott's parable in Flatland, is that just as the two-dimensional individual rose above into the third three-dimension and has a new understanding of what Flatland is. So in the case of consciousness, we do not have to assume that there's a fourth dimensional observer to understand consciousness. Rather, we are understanding consciousness within consciousness itself.
So does that mean that do you think that he's implying that consciousness is easier to understand than we might have previously thought for that reason?
Possibly. I mean, if you're taking consciousness that consciousness is something, then you're avoiding the infinite regress, which definitely Husserl had fallen into. Because, again, to review, is that when we bracket reality from the natural standpoint, which is, here's an apple, we describe it in the natural standpoint, but if we bracket that, we're just observing it as an object of consciousness. That what is actually doing the observing? This is where the transcendental ego came into the picture. Okay, so the transcendental ego is what one is aware of, perceiving the object in a bracketed sense, under the epoche, as Husserl called it. But then you start to ask a question, what's behind the transcendental ego? Now you see where there's a problem with an infinite regress, because then you're going to be, well, what's behind that? What's behind that? What's behind that? What's behind that? Okay. So by saying consciousness is something, you're avoiding that in infinite regress.
Okay. So you can't view it from that transcendental perspective of the transcendental ego.
Well, you could, but again, it's the infinite regress.
Right.
Okay. Because let's use another term. So let's say that you have a self. Okay. The self is what is doing the perception. All right. So perception begins with the self. But if you perceive yourself, you say that I'm aware of myself. Now you could take the Humean tack and say all it is just a bundle of perceptions, but we'll put that aside for the moment. If I'm perceiving myself, or I claim to perceive myself, then what is perceiving myself?
Right. Is he saying that consciousness is what is perceiving yourself, or is he just saying that that consciousness happens and it's like, well, like you were saying, it's a mistake to view it as being conscious of something?
Right. Now, sure, we could say that I'm conscious of your voice, but I guess one could even say that that's adding to an abstraction. Okay, I am conscious of, I'm using language to describe this, but I'm still conscious. I'm conscious. I'm a conscious being.
So like, I am conscious.
I'm conscious. Yeah.
Okay.
Okay.
And is that part of why philosophers, well, I'm sure many other reasons too, but is that part of why philosophers still today just debate about what consciousness is?
Sure. They can't seem to put their finger on what consciousness is. Is it, well, first of all, does it exist? if you say that it exists, then what are its qualities? Does consciousness possess these qualities in and of themselves, or what do you do about the brain? Is consciousness an epiphenomenon of the brain? Any kind of a mental process is just it supervenes, the term is, which means that it rides upon, in other words, of a physical process.
Mm-hmm.
Then you're like, so what you're saying is that consciousness is a brain state? Well, not necessarily, because you can observe a brain state, but is that consciousness? You see where they get tangled up into this? Because in order to define consciousness, you're referring to something else, but by referring to something else, then you seem to be getting yourself into a thicket in terms of describing consciousness. So they still have not been able to really say what consciousness is.
Yeah, that can be well, it can present problems with the sort of materialistic, reductionist, scientific explanation of consciousness as an emergent phenomenon of the brain and as a brain state, as you said. Like, I think people like Daniel Dennett argue that.
Yeah, for sure. And in fact, just one other point is that Daniel Dennett in the late 80s talked quite a bit about intentionality. And in fact, I used as one book The Intentional Stance in my master's thesis. But he did
Oh, cool.
he took intentionality a little bit further than just a consciousness. Intentionality was a directedness behavior of an organism.